I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You were there once in your life.
Hi, people. Trish Wood here. And this is Trish Wood is Critical. And that I am. I'm critical in many ways. I'm critical of things. And I think some of you might believe now that listening to this podcast is a critical part of your life. So at least I hope you do. And we think critically too. See, that word works in a number of ways for us here. That's why I named the show Trish Wood is Critical, because of that triple kind of entendre thing. The CBC is taking a bit of a whooping. It's been taken out to the woodshed, as they say, by Elon and over a number of issues that I've been talking about a lot in my Substack. And also I was privileged to be invited onto Rupa Subramania's show to talk about the CBC. We had a lovely conversation. She's one of my favorite people, one of my favorite reporters in this country. We have quite a good rapport, she and I. So hunt that down if you're interested. And I also posted on my Substack a bit of a monologue I did about the CBC. So I did write about it a bit too. So, and what prompted all this, just credit where credit is due, people. And that's Rodney Palmer, who was on the show last week. And he worked at CBC and CTV and other places. He dropped this amazing evidence at the National Citizens Inquiry, which I'm also pushing a little bit because I think we're the only country in the world doing this. The citizens have taken it upon themselves to explore and examine what happened during COVID-19, because you know what? The people who did it to us are not honest enough or thoughtful enough to look at themselves, and the media is not pushing them to look at themselves because, as I've said on the show many times before, they were complicit. They were complicit. There was nobody protecting us from out of control, unleashed, unaccountable public health and politicians who realized after lockdown 1, they got a bit of a political bump from the frightened class, right? So they kept on going for years in Ontario, where I am, and other places too. I know we have a lot of listeners in Britain, and they were locked down for a while. Australia, New Zealand. Make no mistake, and Roman Baber, the MPP in Ontario, who was kicked out of caucus for raising issues about lockdowns early on, said to me just the other day that it was all about politics keeping these things going. There's no question about that. All of this heartbreak and damage and cognitive dissonance created, the depression, the suicide, the lost businesses, the missed cancer screenings, all of that stuff. After lockdown 1, remember, flatten the curve, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. After lockdown 1, they kept doing it for political reasons. They didn't know how to get out of it. So instead of getting out of it and saving us, they kept on going. So we mustn't ever forgive them for that. And right up there, one of the very worst was the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, a building full of extremely smart people who should have stepped into the breach asking hard questions like Marianne Cloack did on this show and went into retirement over the way they were handling COVID. I don't know why they did what they did. I cannot explain it. There's no rational reason for throwing the journalistic handbook, and there is one at CBC, out the window. And I don't think anywhere in that handbook it says, when there's a special crisis, forget all of your journalistic training and start shilling for the government. I don't think it said anywhere that's what they're supposed to do. So who knows? I did say in my interview with Rupa that I think it's less about the money that the CBC gets and more about the idea that they are like-minded. They are ideologically driven in the same direction as our leftist prime minister. And we saw that across the board. There was a left-right or left-conservative divide on who was thinking critically about COVID policy and who wasn't. There's no doubt about that. Absolutely no doubt about it, except in Ontario, where the Conservatives were also all in. Well, I guess Trump was at the beginning too, and kind of still is based on the things he's saying, which is a bad move. He's not going to go far with that. Anyway, back to CBC. So I've been doing a lot of talking about it, and I'm happy to use my experience as a senior person there, which I was on the premier investigative show, which is the Fifth Estate, and, ruminate on how we got where we are, which is a very, very dangerous place. Elon slapped a label on CBC, which they didn't like. And then he switched it up and made it funny. And they didn't like that either. So they took their toys and went away, as did NPR and the BBC, I believe. But here's what I will say to them. The people in those buildings need to try to figure out why people don't trust them anymore. I mean, they've got their little group of hypnotized viewers, but every day people are peeling off. And it's not because of misinformation and disinformation, which is the lie they spread to ridicule indie media because people don't trust them anymore. That's not why people are peeling off. People are not stupid, right? The truckers showed us that. People are not stupid. They can see through a scam. And, we all, to some degree, delivered our goodwill at the very beginning of the pandemic, but when it stopped making sense, people said, no more. You're doing too much damage. You're harming people. And the CBC should have gotten on that train, right? They should have. But, it's not unlike weapons of mass destruction and all of the other so-called noble lies that are told that get us into misbegotten wars and other things. The media goes all in, usually at the beginning. And sometimes later they say they're sorry, but this is a habit they're in. Now, I'm trying to remember where CBC was on the Iraq War and weapons of mass destruction. I don't actually remember, but I know that the American networks were all in, and like Phil Donahue lost his show because he was interviewing people like Scott Ritter, who said this is nonsense, right? Anyway, so that my week was kind of, subsumed by CBC and talking about CBC, which I will continue to do if people want to ask me. I feel like I have a responsibility to do that. Before I do my pitch, I want to tell you who the guest is today. The guest today is Ms. Ann Bauer, who is a friend of the show. She is one of America's premier essay writers. She's a brilliant writer. She wrote a piece for Tablet Magazine that was so terrific. I read the whole thing on air. The whole article, right? Many, many thousands of words. And I'm going to do a little bit with her like I did with Jeffrey Tucker, a kind of a review. And here's why. I have a sense of we're going to move on beyond COVID is overtaking our society right now. And for those of us who were awake and screaming, that's a very, very tough thing to watch because we're not ready to do that. We are not ready to do that. There needs to be some truth and reconciliation. The NCI is doing wonderful work, but I suspect they're preaching to the choir. I hope not. The CBC did go and cover one story, yay, and they played it straight, so that was good. But they're moving on. And the people who are saying, oh, it was a mistake, they couldn't have known, it was a novel virus. That's just BS. I knew in March of 2020, so let's just forget what I knew. You know why I knew it, because I knew about the age stratified risk, right? And I knew that they got the infection fatality rate wrong too. I knew those two things in March just by being kind of vaguely aware of science. And also, of course, I'd worked with Tony Fauci before, so he didn't have my undivided admiration the way he did with many, many journalists working that story. So people are moving ahead with their lives. There doesn't seem to be any kind of an official accounting going on. And I don't think that's going to be good for any of us. So I brought Ann on, as I did with Jeffrey, to talk about that. We mustn't forget this. We must, I know we all want to be happy again, and there are days when I am, but we have to pick this over. And I think as a podcaster, I have to keep talking about it every once in a while because it was a massive historical event. And we can't kind of close the curtains and say it didn't happen. It did happen. We were betrayed by every single pillar of democracy. Every single one. And medicine, too. We got to figure out how that happened. Climate change, zealotry is coming down the pike. The 15-minute city is coming down the pike. They do think of us now as obedient cattle. They got away with it and we let them. And don't think for a minute that these people who would lock down children and public health officials who would say, oh, well, if your child comes home and they test positive, just lock them in their room and deliver trays of food outside. They actually said that in Ontario, Canada. So don't think for a minute that they wouldn't try this again now that they've primed the pump. So that's why Ann's going to be on. But we're also going to talk about other things too, how her life has changed, her writing, and our love of a certain fictional television character from Happy Valley. So it's a really good conversation. So stick around for that. And I'll do my pitch quickly. Our funding is primarily through Substack now because we want to support them because they support free speech. Even though it is on Substack, the primary thing that you are supporting is the podcast. Although I do write a piece, usually one a week, and drop other things when I can. So do consider supporting us there. It's important. Indie media is important right now. Especially as people are peeling off legacy media, we need to be strong, credible alternatives to that so that we can get people away from being programmed by the legacy media, which is mostly wrong about most things. Ukraine war, wrong. COVID-19, wrong. Just wrong about everything. They're ideologues now, and they're failing. So that's why we're here. But you got to help us out. I also know that there's a jillion of us right now, too, many who are terrific and who I also support. My little monthly tab of supporting indie writers is getting big. But I feel like we got to do it because that's our way out of this thing. So please, if you can afford it, do consider supporting this show. I pay people. The people who work for me are not unpaid interns. They're real live people who do a wonderful job for me. So I would be grateful for that. My social media is kind of fun. I'm ruder there. So you can find me on Twitter at Wood Reporting. I'm on Substack too, obviously. Trish Wood is Critical Substack. And I have a merch store on the trishwoodpodcast.com website, which is my personal website. And we do post the shows there too. So we're going to get to my friend Ann. But first, I want to just play a clip of another friend of mine that I made through while reporting on the podcast. His name is Dr. Francis Christian. You'll remember the story. He was fired from surgery career, and I believe teaching too in Saskatchewan for saying then what WHO has finally recognized, which is we shouldn't be jabbing kids. They fired him in that awful meeting that was taped, you'll recall. They suggested he needed psychiatric help because he was questioning the edicts coming down from public health. Hello, that's like Soviet level Pravda stuff. Let's send him to a re-education camp. He's thinking critically. I mean, But the thing about Dr. Christian, who I got to see again at the wonderful Censorship in Medicine conference at Bedeck that I was honored to have hosted for Chris Milburn, who set it up, is that he's the real thing. He is an elegant, thoughtful, kindly, moral human being, a surgeon who also writes poetry. That never happens, let me tell you. I've known a lot of surgeons in my life. He's a wonderful, wonderful person, and be proud that he lives in this country and had the courage to speak out. He gave evidence, I believe, yesterday at the National Citizens Inquiry And I'm just going to play a little clip of that for you to hear. He's talking about the historical importance of the betrayal around COVID-19 policies, including the vaccines.
The Nuremberg Trials were essentially held after the Second World War in order to make sure that such a thing never happens again. And the doctor's trial was as kind of a subset of the Nuremberg Trials. And after that, there was the Nuremberg Code that was published, which made sure that no experiment can be done on anybody without proper informed consent. And at the time of this letter, at the time of this press conference that I had, and even to this day, I believe, it is still an experiment, a massive experiment on a large scale, on a population which hasn't been given the information for informed consent. You can only give informed consent if you have the information for informed consent. And so I pointed out that that Nuremberg Code is being violated. And therefore, that violation could constitute a crime against humanity.
So I ask you to think about what he just said and ask yourself, which part of that isn't true? I remember when people first started talking about Nuremberg cases, Nuremberg trials, and they'd not specifically the doctor's trials, but the Nuremberg trials around COVID-19. And I thought, oh, that's hyperbole. We haven't. But when he puts it that way, think about it, because we were not told anything about the vaccines that was true. We heard safe and effective, don't ask questions, safe. They weren't safe. People were harmed. They do admit that now. And they didn't stop transmission. 2 big lies, right? 2 big lies. Yeah, that means they were experimental then. Because look, you don't not have information because you're inept. You don't not have information because you didn't want the information. If they'd kept these things in proper clinical trials for a longer period of time, they would have known this, right? We could have protected the actual vulnerable people from COVID if we'd smartened up about long-term care, which we didn't, and waited for proper testing. But no. We had to rush them to market, which means there was no informed consent because the trials weren't long enough. Even if they had by a fluke worked out, they still weren't long enough. You can't guess about what long-term data is. You need long-term data, but we didn't have it. They weren't safe and effective. And so I think we have to look at that and say he makes a great point. And I'll tell you one more thing before we go to Ann. I interviewed on this show a medical ethicist, just a straight shot guy who teaches medical ethics at a university. Very, very clever chap. And we talked about some of this stuff, and much of what has happened during COVID-19 has been a massive violation of medical ethics that they teach in university. And so the question for us is, why did they all go along with it? Very few doctors spoke out. I mean, many heroes did, yes. But I'm just talking about your average family physician. Why did they go along with it? These huge violations of medical ethics. It's really a shocking and unsettling thing that you put these things to the test in a crisis and they all failed. Media, medicine, politics, in some cases, our neighbors, our friends, our family. Wow, it all failed, didn't it? And it failed really quickly. Amazing how quickly it all failed and how quickly it fell. I'll never forget Laura Dodsworth on the show. She wrote the big investigative book called State of Fear about the fear campaign they used to keep us compliant and obedient. And she said the scariest thing to her wasn't even the fear campaign. It was how quickly everybody fell so easily into tyranny without asking any questions. I agree with that. She's very smart. Anyway, I was so happy to hook up with my friend Ann Bauer again for it's another longish interview. So, if you're going for a drive somewhere, or maybe you can have a long hot bath or something along those lines. I don't know how you listen to the podcast, but this is a long one for you to settle into. It's kind of two old friends who've been through something traumatic together, unpacking it. And, her career's taken a hit, which is awful. And so we're unpacking a bunch of stuff that I think will resonate with many of the listeners of this show. So here is my interview with Ann Bauer. Hi, Ann. How are you?
Good. How are you, Trish?
I'm doing well. We're kind of working our way through. I'm calling it the post COVID-19 consciousness period, in the sense I feel like we're all moving on now part. And those of us who experience something terrible are saying, well, wait a minute, when are we going to resolve what happened? At least that's my feeling. What about you?
Oh, that is so my feeling.
Yeah.
I was online with Jen Say, our friend, the other day, and we were sharing this, we both feel that sort of hangover of, oh, I said all these things and it seemed so important and now no one cares. And, it's back to sort of life as usual. And what was that thing?
Yes, I got the sense that there was a feeling about that in some of the emails we exchanged too, right? That a lot of people, yourself and Jennifer and other great and brave people, kind of stuck their heads up over the parapet and were correct in their criticisms, and yet nothing really has been acknowledged about the criticisms that you people were, well, and everybody on this show too, were making then. So it's a bit weird, isn't it? It's really like if a tree falls in the forest and the legacy media doesn't talk about it, did it really fall? I mean, that's right where we are.
Yes, it does feel that way. And it also feels like a lot of the people who really celebrated our sticking our heads up sort of retreated and said, oh, yeah, I was allied with you during that, but that's over. I don't want to speak for Jen. I adore her and we share a lot, but I think that's kind of where we both were with this, like, oh, we alienated our former community, the community that we grew up in. And then the people who were so excited and embraced us now are like, yeah, you're not really ours.
What are you talking about? Tell me more about that. That really interests me.
One of the reasons that I think people like me and Jennifer and Janine Younes, who is that brilliant constitutional lawyer, former Democrat.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that we made this turn during COVID was because we saw the nuance and we saw the problems that were arising because of policy. We didn't go wholesale over to the other side, so to speak. We didn't suddenly embrace an entirely right-wing point of view. We just said, we look at what the politicians, the leaders, and the constituents, the voters in our former community are doing, and it seems wrong to us. And we really got a lot of flack for that. But now I still remain, and I think most of us still remain, in a sort of center place where we're not really interested in leaping all the way over to the other extreme. And so some of the people who we fought alongside for school opening and, the rights of freedom that we thought we were all guaranteed, those people have looked at us and said, oh, yeah, I can't abide your position on whatever it is, abortion, trans equality, whatever.
Right.
And so you're dead to me.
Wow.
And so we've really come out. I think Janine's great. I think she's sort of finding her way, but I know that Jen and I were having this conversation about like, oh my God, where are we?
Yeah.
We're really in a no man's land.
Yeah. Well, I remember that having those discussions, early on with with all three of you, because all three of you have been on the show. And it's the idea that this is a kind of a political homelessness for everybody. But I don't think, I guess it's my view that I don't think that you have to, do we have to embrace every issue on every side in order to, like, I've had some arguments with listeners of mine because I said I was a feminist, and they weren't huge arguments, but there's a lot of anger out there about the branch of feminism that was pretty mean to men, right? And I'm now obviously a mother of two grown men, so I don't feel that way about it. I think that was probably a mistake, right? So I embrace feminism. I think I embrace everything with caveats now, but I don't feel that differing, especially on some of the cultural stuff, is a reason to not respect each other. And I feel that that's really a creation of media. Like, we're so siloed right now, right? We were super siloed over COVID, and now we're siloed over a whole bunch of new stuff. And I think that is actually what they want. I mean, I think they want us to be at each other's throats on these things.
I do too. I'm going to, start right off with something that's definitely incendiary. The way that the trans issue has been exploded in every direction, I think, is very much a product of media insisting that people pick from extreme sides about what would have seemed 3 or 4 years ago like a small issue that affected a relatively minor portion of the population that we needed to handle with grace and dignity and compassion, but it didn't need to consume our everyday. The fact that it is now in my news feed, in my news, in my, it's like I can't have a conversation that does not touch on this.
Yeah.
Which I believe is a manufactured phenomenon.
I disagree with you about that. And I'll explain why, what my feeling about it is. And it goes back to when I did my original investigative reporting on multiple personality and satanic ritual abuse and recovered memory. And that was a phenomenon where people were kind of captured by psychology and academia in that moment, believing a thing, right? So children were being coached, especially in McMartin preschool, to believe that they'd been abused, and women were being convinced that they had 100 personalities, and et cetera, et cetera. And so when the trans thing exploded again, I'm with you. I think it's a thing to be treated with grace and kindness. That's always been my position with any of the kind of authentically body dysphoric people I know. But it looks to me like what's happened, and this had a resonance for me about the old reporting we did about a captured profession, meaning psychology, is that there's a whole bunch of people now claiming transism who are actually fetishists, right? Autogynephiles, people who get erections from wearing women's clothing. There's a whole bunch of other stuff being thrown into the mix now. And where with somebody like Caitlyn Jenner, if she came to dinner and I would of course refer to her as she, as I always have every drag queen and trans person I've ever met authentically. But it's the forcing of all of this other stuff under the rubric that has triggered me as a woman to be very, very afraid. And I do sort of feel we're being thrown under the bus on that issue, right? I don't feel that a lot of people claiming to be trans actually are body dysphoric. I think it's other sick stuff going on. And by that, I mean mental illness in the culture. And so the question is, do we indulge that, or do we say there's something else going on and we've got to deal with it a different way? So those are my views. And I write about it a bit. And I think it's because I'm triggered and feel threatened by the knee-jerk reaction to assign female spaces to anybody who claims that they're female. That frightens me, right? And we're seeing a lot of that in Britain. So that's my take on it. I'm assuming you don't agree, and that's perfectly fine that you don't agree. I respect very much your opinions.
You know what's interesting?
What?
I agree with 95% of what you just said.
Yeah.
And that is what's so weird about this issue, is that when we speak about it with very small gradations of difference, it's assumed that that we don't agree.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
when I say that it's a product of media, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's exactly it. I started seeing television shows and movies, and of course, Transparent is that brilliant example of this brought this issue that wasn't really on anyone's mind on a daily basis. You know, certainly some people were dealing with it, but the general public was not talking about trans issues on a daily basis. And suddenly, boom, there we have Transparent, the television show, and it's all the rage and it's all we're talking about. And I do think that sort of collaboration between media and infotainment, entertainment, internet, you know, the way all these things are colliding, was bringing us to a place where they wanted this to be very much in the zeitgeist. They wanted this to be a primary leading issue. And so I did grow up in Minneapolis in the 80s, so I guess I have known more than my share of non-binary trans people in my life, just because, you know, that was sort of part of the culture around the new wave punk rock, all that stuff that I was engaged in, right?
And we all had a crush on Robert Smith of The Cure and his red lipstick, didn't we?
Oh, totally.
I thought he was the handsomest man who ever lived, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
And Adam Ant and Boy George and Annie Lennox. And that was so much my kind of formative years. So my knee jerk is to say not a big deal. But the thing is, I completely agree with you that people who are not authentically part of that small group are moving in under this umbrella for political reasons. I completely agree with you that women's spaces must be kept safe. I completely agree that people who were born biological men have an unfair advantage competing in sports against women, and it is outrageous that we would put them in the same classification. So when I say that I think that our differences are sort of ginned up by media, I think this is exactly what I'm talking about.
Well, I find it very hard to get up these days and engage. It's a real problem for me. And it's because, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, we have unfinished business here, people. And the unfinished business is that people in positions of power and authority, in positions of trust like public health, went batshit for 3 years. Or maybe they didn't go batshit. Maybe they knew what they were doing. It's hard to know. But to just move on because so many people in positions of power who should be excavating this now are actually complicit in it is really awful. And it leaves, I think maybe one of the things you're feeling is it leaves those of us who were awake to it feeling quite unstable. Now, I don't know if you know what's happening here. We're doing the National Citizens Inquiry, which is it's a traveling set of hearings run just completely by the citizenry, headed by some lawyers and other people who got the idea, and they're taking testimony, and that's quite great. It's kind of like a repeat of my show. I mean, they've got most of the people who've been on my show giving evidence. So that's sort of fun, including Francis Christian, who I love. But even that is not solving it, because until there is an acknowledgement and an apology, like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of some sort, those of us who saw it and lived it and were flattened by it will struggle a bit, I think.
So, I love you, and it hurts me to say this. I don't think it will ever be aired.
What?
I don't think that reconciliation is ever going to come. And I will return to the essay that I wrote in 2021. It was the parallel that kept running through my head of Bruno Bettelheim, this medical fraudster who came over to the United States, came up with a theory, totally stitched it together out of nothing. He wasn't even a doctor, and convinced the entire psychiatric and medical community that mothers caused their children's autism and other developmental disorders. And for years, these children were taken away, and the mothers were either put into therapy or institutions, or, in some cases, sort of alienated, banished by their families. He died in 1990, and all of these things came out maybe 6 months after his death. He'd plagiarized, he'd known his theory was wrong. There were all sorts of reasons to expose this, and it was just sort of neatly covered up. And when I wrote this piece in 2021, people from all over the world wrote to me and said, "Oh, I had no idea this happened. What a terrible thing. Why don't I know about why does no one talk about this?" And it was a University of Chicago, psychiatric association of various countries, media cabal that basically covered this up and said, "Oh, let's not talk about that anymore." We're not going. Well, we'll just dust all that over there and we'll go on. We just won't do that anymore.
Well, it's really interesting because with this case, with what we've just lived through, and with the example I gave before of this recovered memory and all the innocent men who went to jail, etc., from this false evidence created through hypnotherapy in psychiatric sessions, what ended it was not that there was some great national reckoning, but rather malpractice lawsuits. And I've said before on the show, that's what's going to kill the trans extremism in schools and the giving children, the double mastectomies for teenagers, which happens, and the other kind of irreversible stuff they're doing on kids. That's going to end because there's going to be malpractice suits, right? And sadly, it's the money that shuts it down. There's never I still have not seen, although I'm sure it's been written, I have not seen a mea culpa on behalf of the psychiatric profession around the damage done during that period that we did that reporting. It's like weapons of mass destruction. People just move on. They just say, "Oh, well."
Right. And there was
right?
that memory expert, I'm trying to remember her name, who had to start traveling with armed guards.
With armed guards, that's right. And she was a magnificent human being whose name will come to me in a minute because she and I are very friendly. She would go to these conferences to give evidence on actual memory and how it works. And what she said was, memory it doesn't work like a videotape. It can be corrupted by this and distorted by that. And because women were saying, because they'd been taught in therapy, I remember it perfectly because the trauma of the moment embedded it in my head and I'll never forget it, right? And it was a completely phony memory. But Elizabeth Loftus is her name. It just came. The synapse fired, and she had to go with bodyguards because there was such hostility. And the hostility toward her, it's interesting, it wasn't about the science. It was like she was violating one of the kind of precious texts of a church. And that's kind of what happened, I think, with COVID-19 too. The people who were critical of it were treated, actually as heretics, right? As religious heretics, right? So I think that maybe there won't be something like that. And I, on one hand, want to shake people on the street and say, I was right and you were wrong, and you need to smarten up because they're going to try it again with climate change or something. or some new virus or something. And, but of course, I won't do that. I'll just talk to people like you and Jennifer and Jeffrey Tucker and others who lived through a moment wide awake and that other people kind of slept through.
So as you were talking, it occurred to me, and this could be wrong, it's in the moment, but I agree with you that there will be a comeuppance for the rapid transitioning of children. And that will be because those children grow up and they say, I don't like this. This happened to me. It affected my fertility. I now have cancer, whatever it is. And I completely agree with you that that one will turn sharply, and it will turn on lawsuits and money and stories of lost lives. The thing with COVID is people were either complicit in that they wanted the restrictions and the 7, 9, 48 vaccines, or they were insulated from it, and so they don't care. And so we don't really have a cohort. We have this small little group of us, but we don't really have a cohort that's going to go forward and say, I was hurt by these policies. I am surrounded by, well-to-do leftists who didn't suffer from them at all.
Right. Yeah.
And they have no reason to go after anyone. And in fact, will reelect the people who imposed what I think were really killing policies that have no precedent.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think it's rich leftists who are the problem, or lefties who are the problem now in this scenario, because they didn't suffer, they didn't struggle in any way, shape, or form, and they did feel, I believe, there was something virtuous about the positions that they took. I feel that's what they were doing. So I had Jeffrey Tucker on a couple of weeks ago, and he and I were talking about what happened to him sort of emotionally and cognitively during that 3 years. And he said a couple of really interesting things, which I agreed with because I experienced them too. He said that he stopped liking music, or he stopped relating to music the way he had before, which I thought was really interesting because I did too. And I'm just wondering if you had any kind of fundamental changes in either your sort of creative world or your emotional world.
Oh, that's such a good question. And I have to start by saying my husband and I listened to that entire episode of you and Jeffrey in the car, and I was weeping, and I swear he was equally moved in his way. It was one of the most honest, raw, transcendent things I've ever heard on the last 3 years. So thank you for that.
Well, he's something, isn't he? I mean, Jeffrey's just the best,
He really is. Listening to him makes me feel like I've gone to church.
I know. And he's so generous. He and I couldn't be, in a sense, more different. I mean, intellectually, we're pretty well connected, right? But, I'd met him like I'd met you. He'd come for the interview and he'd kind of swept in a cape. It was so funny and great. And, he does listen to Mahler and all,
I know, which I cannot get behind.
He's a much more cultured human being than I am or will ever be, but we do have this connection. But I think Jeffrey has that connection with a lot of people. I think he's just a really sort of generous guy. And it's like being able to go and have dinner with your favorite, really smart uncle, sophisticated uncle who indulges you. That's how I feel about Jeffrey.
Well, and it really was the two of you together. You revealed things, he revealed things. It felt like I was getting the real story from two people I have the utmost respect for. So it was just a brilliant couple of hours. 3. maybe.
Oh, thank
I don't
you.
know. I just drank them all down.
It was long.
So on the music front, and I've tried with Mahler. I've tried. I don't get it. I, somewhere during COVID, sort of pivoted to the blues. It was all I listened to. I mean, old school. Yes.
Really?
30s, 40s, 50s. I fell in love with this Philadelphia group called The Times, I think, and just listen to this repetitively. It was on all the time in our house.
Wow.
And there was something about that, people singing about the the shit the world really has for you, and how fundamental that suffering is. And I hope I don't sound like some pretentious, middle class person saying, oh, I have suffered like someone who worked in the fields, because I have not. But there was something about that music that comforted me in a way that nothing else touched. As I said, I am that new wave kid. I'm the Joe Jackson, the Cure, the Fine Young Cannibal. That was my era. And God help us, I have a soft spot for the Bee Gees that we just can't get into.
Well, who doesn't though?
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I've wept. I think there's only one. Are they all gone, or is
Andy's still alive?
Andy still alive? I've wept at the deaths of all of them, and I go on these Bee Gees kicks, and there was quite a high-end documentary about them, and there's something magnificent about the Bee Gees, and I'll just say it. Like I think they're great.
Yeah.
And there's something about certain songs where I'm like, I'm reliving my teen years.
I do know.
They're terrific.
Yes. Spirits having flown. I play it at least 3 times a week. And so, there were a couple of my favorites that I kept, but the sort of like, I would listen to a lot of hip hop. I would listen to a lot of kind of the 70s music started to irritate me, mostly because all those guys were swirling around telling me I had to stay inside and take another shot. And I'm like, oh my God, Neil Young, leave me alone. I loved you for all those years, and now I just am so irritated.
Yeah. I mean, Neil Young and Joni too, who was my spirit animal as a lonely teen, walked away in North Vancouver in my bedroom with a Gibson J45 jumbo acoustic steel string guitar, trying to learn her open tunings, which is hopeless. It can't be done, right? I think it was like one of the Led Zeppelin people said she was the best guitar player who ever lived. And I sort of believe that about her, but I don't know what it is with these old rockers who were edgy once, and they think they're being edgy now by demanding people take a vaccine and shitting on poor Eric Clapton, who got it totally right. Yeah. I mean, it was awful to watch them fall one by one. And I was waiting for, I mentioned in one of my old shows, Eric Clapton, who I also had a mad crush on back in the day, riding to the rescue as he did. And it didn't help his career either. And they went after him when he did it. But people like Joni and Neil, I mean, Neil wrote that great song, the Four Dead in Ohio. Like, he was really like out there doing great revolutionary music. And for him to be all kind of, get your shot, it's the right thing to do, Ugh.
Well, it just kind of felt like they all were like, I've taken every drug. I've laid every human I've met for the last 50 years. And now I'm sort of like calming down, and I want everyone around me to be safe. And I just had no time for that.
No, it was really, well, it means, you know what it means, I think, Ann? I think people stop thinking maybe at a certain point in their lives. The curse for me is that I'm not going quietly into the good night. At my age, I should be, going back to my little decoupage hobby and stuff.
Don't you dare.
Well, yeah, I know. If I get a country house, which I desperately want, I may do that. But I'm in here all day long duking it out informationally and kind of like you in a sense. I think I'm maybe more, I wouldn't call myself conservative, but like I'm fully involved in the trans battle for the reasons I explained, and not, and I'm upset by it. I think it's like, who Margaret Atwood just came out and said something about Margaret. J.K. Rowling is being heroic here. Like, why are you throwing women under the bus? So I'm in this kind of what's the word? I'm bellicose, right? I'm bellicose. I'm fighting within the informational silo. But the other part of me says exactly what you are saying to yourself, which is, why are people making such a big, well, I guess they are because it's in schools. That frightens me greatly. And I would be homeschooling if I had young children right now for a variety of reasons. But I feel like I should let it go, but maybe I can't. Maybe I'm just permanently triggered because of COVID or something.
So I want to return, because you said you and Jeffrey talked about the ways that it changed you, and that was
yeah,
very important for me to hear, because there are things that changed in me that I thought, oh yeah, that part of me is permanently broken. I don't know if I'm ever going to get it back. That sense that there is a way for good to prevail. I'm still waiting for that to come back. One of the things that I related to when Jeffrey was talking about music, and this is the kind of connection it made for me. My son died in 2016, and I used to joke and say he's only slightly less communicative now than he was in life, because he had been a very taciturn guy. And I really felt him around me in the years after he died. And at a certain point during COVID, when everything felt so dystopian and cold and inhuman, I lost that sense of him. And I hope it's not gone forever, because I don't think I could stand that. But there was this terror in me that all of the fear and all of the hatred and all of that darkness around me was sort of like some sort of dome that kept me from experiencing what spiritual grace I had felt previously. And I think right now that's sort of my mission is, I don't know if I find it in writing. I don't know if I find it in people. I don't know if I find it in the nature, but resuming that sense of the infinite, that's what I really want. But see, I think that Jeffrey and I, if I may speak for Jeffrey Tucker, which intimidates me greatly, I think we're kind of talking about the same thing. That sense of the infinite is what music is. It's magic, that these tones can be made and they say something that is greater than all of us. And I'm looking for the same sort of connection on a personal, spiritual, metaphysical front, to feel like I have that connection to my child.
So was it a feeling that Andrew had a presence around you and then there was no presence of him? Or was it something different than that?
It was, at the risk of being Shirley MacLaine.
I get that reference. I know exactly what
I love Shirley.
Yeah.
So whatever.
Yeah.
It was a sense that he flickered in and out. And I'll tell you, my kid, everyone says their kid is unusual. Believe me, my kid was unusual. He came to us looking beautiful and whole, and I think he was in his way. And at 3.5, he changed dramatically. He lost English. Bear with me here. He picked up Spanish. My child was fluent in Spanish and could barely speak in English for most of his life. We could never explain it. And I'm not saying he picked it up out of the ether. When he started going to school, he was able to relearn. He was able to learn Spanish cold. He was not able to relearn English. So I had this kid who sort of had this, are you wired for something different? He had preternatural abilities with spatial things. He was a chess master. He was all those things. But he really struggled with, like the steps to do laundry. So was he autistic? Kind of. Was he something else? Yes. I don't know. He was his own guy. And when he died, I felt the same sort of weirdness and colors and, the sense, the whiff of him every once in a while, like, oh my God, he's around that corner. I saw two young men who looked almost exactly like him in 3 years apart. Both of them were Black men, and yet they had exactly his look. They just looked at me, and I swear I saw him. I mean, parents of children who've died will tell you these stories, and maybe they're true and maybe they're not. I don't know, but they're very comforting. It's very comforting to feel visited by the colors and the smells and the humor and the every once in a while voice in your head that you think, oh my God, did I really hear that? And all of that disappeared. That's what left me.
When?
It was
How long into it?
It was like late 2020, when winter set in 2020. And, we'd gone through the spring and we'd done the shutdown and we're going to do all these things and we're going to beef up our medical supplies and then we're going to go on with life. And then the screws turned. And in my state, we had the snitch line for people who left their homes or had someone over. We had curfews where we couldn't leave our house after 7:00. We had all sorts of what I think of as like Soviet era authoritarian crackdown. Our friends had gotten either furious or terrified, or there was no lightness, and suddenly those feelings I'd had, those bits of connection and whimsy and like, oh, I see the light of him somewhere. It was gone.
I wonder if this, based on what you just said and what Jeffrey said about music I'm a completely different person too. I'm scarily different now. I wonder if one day a really smart psychiatrist or biologist or somebody will write a report or a study saying that what we just lived through actually changed a part of our brain,
Mm-hmm.
right? I feel like my brain is different. I know that I'm still a fan of music because if I still can't listen to On the Nature of Daylight. I can't without weeping. I weep instantly the first 8 bars and I'm a goner. My kids look at me like I'm completely insane. It's almost an aggressive kind of grasp of me, certain pieces of music. So that's still there. But where I used to in the car have the radio on all the time, I did a lot of singing and bopping on road trips with, a can of Coke and a pack of cigarettes back in the day when I was a reporter working alone. Though, and I did it until COVID without the cigarettes and the Coke. But I don't do that anymore. I don't look forward to a road trip because I can turn the radio on and get a huge release of dopamine or whatever it was, right? I also don't care as much about basketball, which sounds ridiculous, but basketball was religion in our house until COVID. Obviously, the Raptors won the trophy that year. It was a miracle. Nobody ever thought it would happen, and it brought me and my boys great joy and a lot of time spent together. But I don't care about it anymore. I don't care about things that I cared deeply about before and that physically impacted impacted me through my brain. So I wonder if this kind of, it's not just the forced isolation, but I think it's forced isolation coupled with tyranny and a feeling of kind of societal hostility that maybe shuts down part of your brain or something like that. And maybe the part of your brain, Anne, that was open to Andrew is diminished in somehow, and that you've got to, maybe in time, you can kind of get it going again through spiritual practice or something like that. I don't know, but I do feel something shifted. Clearly something has shifted in you and Jeffrey too. And I know Jay, I know a lot of people have had a big shift. So it's not just that we're sad or depressed. There's something else going on.
Absolutely. And I'm working on bringing that part back because I think it's necessary for me, but it's also what makes its purpose. You know, it's like, what else are we doing here? And I do believe that we will be able, through these same things, music, spiritual practice. My assessment of it was that there's that old axiom about, you know, there are only two states of being or only two emotions. There's fear and love, right? Everything else branches off of that. And I know that that's a kind of pop psych sort of trope, but I think fear took hold. And all of the things that come out of fear, anger, hate, you know, war, power, everything that comes from fear took hold, and it just poisoned all of us. I think it clamped down like a fog, and we need to make that lift. And I think now the goal is to be part of that, make that fog lift.
Yeah, I think the question is, how do we do it? I went to church, to Mass for the first time since COVID, for Easter by myself, because nobody in the family goes with me, and my husband's Jewish. And I didn't get the same stuff that I normally get from Catholic Mass. I didn't get it from the music either. And maybe this was a particularly not very thoughtful Mass. But it was better than nothing. And I'm glad that I went, and the building itself is beautiful. And it was nice to be with kind of like-minded people, but it wasn't the same experience for me. So I am going to return to Mass in a more deliberate way. But I think the answer lies elsewhere for me too. And I'm not sure where that is. I do know one thing. I do know when I'm with my kids, I'm pretty much myself more than I have been. My boys and I laugh our heads off. That's one thing. We have an element of silly. My youngest boy, Truman, has become a personal trainer before he goes back to get the rest of his degree. And so he's working out with me in the gym, and we spend more time laughing than we do doing, chin-ups, right? And it's so good for us to do that. So in those moments, I feel like my old self, but I would say that's probably the only time is when I'm with the kids.
We have the same experience with our son, Max, who's here in town. And it's the only time you sort of let down your guard and you feel like, oh, here we are.
Yeah.
Here's our people and our safe space,
Here we are.
right?
Yeah.
The other thing,
yeah,
it seems like a tiny thing, but I think it sustained us. My husband and I started playing cards.
Great.
And it's like Skinnerian sort of, it's like behavioral therapy. The minute we sit down at the card table, and we have a special table for it, and we start playing cards.
Good.
I feel this sort of, okay. I am within the game. I know the rules. It's fun. It's competitive. It doesn't matter. And it's sweet. And people have been doing this for centuries.
What do you play? What game?
We play a game called claviage.
I don't think I know that.
Claviage is
Yeah.
a Siberian Jewish bar game. Seriously? Of course
I
you
knew
did.
that.
There's a game called Belote that's played in France that's much the same.
Yeah.
And so my dad, who's a, Siberian Jew, was a competitive bridge player.
Oh,
And
for
this
goodness
is what
sake.
they played while they were waiting for their turn at the table. It's a two-person. It's like a poker meets gin rummy meets bridge meets chair throwing and beer pong. It's crazy. And we play it almost every night.
So that works for you. And being with Andrew works for you. So that's good. The card table thing, that's very Joan Didion. Right? Because they would sit at that table after, well, I think they ate dinner at the card table, even in that great apartment they had in New York.
Yeah, with big honking glasses of scotch. See, we can't do that.
Yeah, I can't do that, but that's okay. But maybe I'll start that. My husband is kind of a backgammon guy. So maybe we'll do backgammon or something, maybe cards, or maybe he likes puzzles too. But that feels very old age for me. And it requires space because you've got to have a big place to leave it while you're working on it, right? But maybe we need that kind of mucking about in some very focused activity to move beyond. But I just want to say this too, because I had this thought, well, just before I was about to speak on the cards. And that is, I feel, this is weird, but I feel like if I move on now, I'm leaving somebody behind, which is such a weird feeling. But it's almost like if I move on from the death of someone I love, I'm leaving them behind. And that's how I sort of feel about moving on from COVID. I know the truth. I know that people were ruined by this, and no one's acknowledging them. There's no, when in my city, Toronto, Canada, there was a kid stabbed, I believe, on the subway 3 weeks ago, dead. This is happening all over the place. We know why. We know why. And nobody's talking about it. And I feel like until we recognize all the people who've been ruined by this, for me to go on and just sort of be my normal Trish self again, it's almost a betrayal of a truth I know that other people don't.
Not only are you being clear, but that is so much the experience of a grieving parent. That's the distillation of it is, that's part of the deal. You live with it forever. And you never stop feeling that bad because they were worth that. I am at peace with that, with never moving on from that, with never being,
Interesting.
I'm okay with the weight of that. So I do think you're holding it,
Yeah.
like you hold the truth for people.
Yeah.
God, that is a hard but truly human and beautiful thing to do.
Well, you know what it is, Ann? We've all seen something, and other people didn't see it, but we've all seen it. And it's very hard to live in a world that doesn't recognize that. It feels like all of the people who've been ruined by COVID policy, and let's face it, the people who also were not protected in long-term care, or most of them died. It's like we should be having, a big moment, a big shared cultural moment about it. But the sleazebags in government who allow this to happen, we interviewed Roman Baber, who said something really interesting. He said after the first lockdown got them a whole bunch of political points, they weren't not going to do the next one. He went in to his people in the Conservative Party in Ontario here, and he said, what are you guys going to do when there's another wave in the fall after we've told people we're going to let them out? And they, why would they not do another lockdown? It was popular. People think they worked. So there was this sort of awful continuation of this very destructive thing for political reasons. Now, obviously, there are a multitude of components to why they got away with that, but the absolute cynicism of that, and never having a kind of collective clarity about the event is, I think it's dragging us all down.
I do too. And you know, I'm sorry, because I feel like I'm just underscoring that I don't think we're going to have a collective. I think 30, 40 years from now, there's going to be a rash of, you know, academics who do this sort of like the COVID-19 era mistakes that were made. You know, it's like it's going to be way down the line. Right now, I have a friend and I love her like a sister. She's been a friend of mine for 30 years. She's suffered a lot of losses in her life. She's as resilient as anyone I know. And she said to me, I know a lot of things were done badly during COVID, but I don't want to think about it anymore. Please don't talk about it. I want to move on with my life and just, you know, play with my grandchildren and be happy.
Yep.
And I can't quibble with her except to say, oh, well, I wish I could do that, but I can't. So, you know, I'm not in that place, but I will respect you and not, you know, go on about it in your presence.
Yeah. Well, there are people who are doing that and need to do that. And maybe one day I'll be one of those people. It's possible I will be. But I think, you know, for me, there's other ways to sort of crack the nut as well. And that's kind of nibbling around the edges on other issues. Like the CBC is imploding here, and that's good. People are talking about it more openly. My friend, Dr. Francis Christian, who is the most decent human being ever, testified at the National Citizens Inquiry recently, maybe yesterday. So all kinds of things are happening that we can focus on, and that's a good thing, I guess. But I don't see me ever being the same person I was before COVID. I don't think my husband will be either, actually. And he is definitely on the same page, although he was not as kind of radically focused on it like I was. But he has also changed. And I think my kids have too. I think they're different. They're not as happy-go-lucky as they were.
Yeah. And I know that we have changed. My husband was more opposed to COVID restrictions than I. He was, in our household, he was immediately in kind of 4-alarm when the restrictions started. He has spent a ton of time trying to safeguard us personally and the people we know from, you know, whatever financial devastation or social or emotional. People think I'm sort of outspoken on Twitter. And, you know, usually when I show my husband what I've said and I say, did I go too far? And he says, oh my God, you did not go far enough. You know, like amp that up.
Yeah, he's my kind of guy. Yeah.
And I can see that he's changed. And when I say this, it's going to sound like a criticism, and it's so not. He's hardened in that he's like this one sort of ethical spear. Like, if it's wrong, I want nothing to, you know, I'm not putting up with this. And I find that helpful for me. There's no waffling, no, well, you know, they were trying to do there's none of that in our household. Yeah.
Yeah, yuck. That's, not doing that. I want to just ask you a bit about what we were talking about at the beginning, which is how people like you who were, I left the left before COVID, right? I left the left over the Russia hoax and the way they treated Donald Trump, for good or ill. I knew they were lying. And as a journalist, I just couldn't abide that. So I started peeling off pretty quickly when I realized how much the left had actually changed. And but for you who still, I think you still, as you said, you're more kind of in tune culturally, I think, with that bunch of people, especially in Minneapolis.
I would not say that at all.
Oh, okay.
In fact, I had a very similar, the Russia collusion thing. I'm ashamed to say I bought it 100% at first.
Yeah.
And then over time, it just became so clear what completely underhanded, false, criminal, just what a lie this all was. And at the same time, I had caucused for Bernie Sanders. I know I say that with the
No, but I loved him too. I loved Bernie too. And I would have voted for Bernie in the 2016 primary. I absolutely would have. I was cheering. And when he did that event in New York City, and there was like 40,000 young people there cheering, and I thought, wow, they're engaged. It's great, And then I saw him sell out to Hillary, who is, like the evil demon to me. And I thought, wow, this guy. I remember watching the convention and crying because the young people there were so completely flattened by his betrayal. And I thought, what the hell is going on here?
Yeah. So those were the two things for me, not only his betrayal, but that whole Debbie Wasserman Schultz thing. I mean, it was so heinous.
Yeah. Rigging the primary. Yeah.
So I have not considered myself a Democrat or voted for a Democratic candidate in years. I live in a place where culturally I'm committed to gay rights, always have been. And the trans train has kind of been hooked to that. And as I say, I try to approach that with caution and compassion. I'm kind of split on the abortion issue, always have been.
Yeah.
I'm one of those, I honestly don't know and would be really happy with a restriction like Europe's.
Me too. I look at abortion is for me, I'm really clear in my obfuscation, right? And that is that this is what everything that drove me from the left is the young women cheering and dancing about abortion rights. Like, whoopee, we have abortion. I'm like, really? It's kind of solemn, sister.
Right.
Like, I wouldn't be dancing.
Yeah.
And right. And also the idea that you can have a full term. What are you, a psychopath? Really? A full, like, forget it. So that those people drive me farther into conservatism than I would normally go. But my position on abortion, and I'll say it, is I think, to quote Bill Clinton, it should be safe, legal, and rare.
Exactly. Yes.
And
yes.
Right. And I think there should be a time limit on it unless there's some grotesque extenuating. And I think the time limit should be like maybe 3 months.
As
no
do
more,
I.
Right. Yeah. So, but I think that makes me a something. I don't know what it makes me, but that's kind of the sensible thing. And I was disgusted watching the way young women were treating this issue. I think I really feel there's something wrong with them to be dehumanizing a little human baby that way. I mean, what is going on with that? And what doctors are doing that particular service?
Here in Minnesota, many. In fact, our governor, I don't know if this is a talking point or if it's real or both, famously signed something saying if during an abortion the baby is born alive.
Oh, don't
exactly.
Sentence.
So, I'm in extreme land here.
But what is it? Tell me what it is. Do finish the sentence. Tell me what it is. If the baby's born alive, what?
They have to complete the abortion.
But see that
and
language.
No, it is so upsetting to me. And so for that reason, because I think, it's been legal for almost my entire lifetime. I think abortion was legalized 2 years after I was born. So I know that there is this longstanding assumption that this is a right. And so my bias is do it when you have a non-sentient cluster of cells if you must. Go ahead, plan B on every corner. Fine. But late term or, in case the baby is born alive, I really have a problem with that, which puts me in that, really squishy, uncomfortable space with neither tribe. But to circle back, I would not consider myself on the left right now. I think I am perhaps, everyone thinks they're a centrist, right? I don't know. I know that the people in my community think of me as pretty hard right.
Do they?
Oh yeah.
That's that. Well, then you know what I would say. They're insane. Then I'm sorry. Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's what the left's problem is right now. They're nuts. They're embracing all kinds of stuff that is absolutely not palatable to a thinking, humane human being. They're captured by ideology. I don't actually think these young women are dancing around celebrating the killing of full-term babies. I don't believe they are. I don't think they've thought about it. I think, there's this meme on the internet called I support the current thing, right? And I think that that's what's happening to people. They want to identify with the kind of left wing, in your country, Democratic, in this country, liberal NDP crowd. And so they buy anything mindlessly, which is kind of what happened with COVID, without actually thinking it through. And I think that your travails and mine are because we do think things through. So that leaves us sort of nowhere, doesn't it?
It does leave us nowhere, and more nowhere these days, even than during COVID, because during COVID we had this overriding. It was actually one of the only times that I felt like part of a team, because we had this one unacceptable wrong that was being committed, and we came together and said, absolutely no. This is, we must fight this. And now it feels very diffuse, and like being in this middle space it's jumping from one chunk of ice to another on the flow. It is a very uncomfortable place to be, socially and professionally, for sure.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you a bit about professionally, but don't give details because I don't want to go there with you if it would hurt you in any way. But do you feel that your position on COVID has hurt your ability to earn a living as a writer?
Oh, God, yes.
Oh, it has. Okay. So tell me about that.
I immediately lost all of my left-leaning. It won't hurt me to say the New York Times, the Washington Post,
good riddance.
It's pretty obvious, right?
Yeah.
The kind of structure of the literary world was entirely not just leaning, but leaning hard. So that disappeared the minute I spoke out on schools. It was gone. I've never written another book review. I used to write for Washington Post Book World on a regular basis. I've never had another friendly correspondence from any of those editors.
Wow.
But then there are so many random things. There was a young man who had moved here. He was part of the publishing group that brought out my last book, moved to the Twin Cities, and he was someone that I was sort of, in a way, mentoring. I had him over for dinner. I showed him around town. When he got married, I was, talking to him, very happy for him. And I actually read his novel 3 times and gave him reader feedback. And when COVID came, and he was a very progressive in the whole sense of that word and what it means today. He embraces the entire progressive ideology.
Wow.
It was like done. And he was someone who, had tons of literary connections in town, was an agent who had said, could we work together on something, so there was that. Then there's the fact that I've found kind of post-COVID writing to be baffling. I had an essay come out in Tablet in 2021 that was hugely successful.
Yep.
I got calls from everywhere, like, would you like to do a book? And would you please come write for us? And would you be on my podcast? And I would say 80% of those maybe 36 people disappeared immediately after the ask. And I think it's not personal. I think it's just...
Well, do you think they were on your Twitter feed or something? Like, what happened? They saw the Tablet piece, which was so good. I read it, the whole thing on the show was so perfect. So they see it and they call you based on your extraordinary talents and insights. And then what do you think happened? Do you think they went on your Twitter feed and saw that you were kind of anti-COVID policy, or what happened there?
I think that may have been the case with one or two, but for the most part, I think this was not personal. I think it was just, oh, wait, here's the new hot thing, like, oh, but there's this, the kind of platform building is happening so fast.
Yeah.
And I was in a conversation with Michael Sanger. I'm going to say that out loud. I really like him.
Yeah, I do too.
And we
He's
were
so
talking. Yeah,
he's so good.
He's wonderful and he's smart, and we don't always agree, but often we do, and whether we do or we don't, we are both quite animated about our opinions.
Yeah.
And we were both saying that often we'll go to write about something after thinking it through and kind of making it, like figuring out what is the nut of this, what do I really want to say, and go out there. And by that time, it's been written about 9 different ways in a dashed off kind of, errors throughout, like it's everywhere, and it's done.
Yeah.
And you don't really have time. You don't have the time to take a breath and think things through, which I think is necessary.
So let me respond to that, because I was going to say to you that you should be on Substack. And the reason that I say that is because the one thing about Substack that is good and true is that it's completely free speech oriented. Now, I live in that world because I do a Substack about once a week, and I write them fast. They're sort of thoughtful, but they're not the same as if I'd had 6 months to think about it, right? But interestingly, that doesn't, I think what's happening with the audience, I think things are moving very, very quickly. And I think people need some affirmation from people who write that they're not going insane, right? So it has a public service, even though, I'll go back and oh, there's a typo I missed. Oh, because I get my husband, who won the spelling bee in Montreal, to do my copy editing quickly, right? Because I'm so busy that writing a Substack most times is wonderful. Sometimes it's a bit of a burden. But people complain if it's late too, right? So the reason I'm telling you this is to say that regardless of whether you're in that moment about that story, let's say a trans thing. Let's say, for instance, the first trans thing I think I wrote about was there was a teacher up here at Oakville Trafalgar High School who was wearing these size XX fake breasts to teach kids. And that's a fetish. I don't care what anybody says. It's not a trans thing. It's a fetish thing, right? And it's been proven later, like he wasn't even dressing trans in his real life. He was only doing it to go to school, or mostly to go to school. So I wrote about that, and I included in it some of the fetishistic behavior on display at some of the gay pride parades, which I personally have marched in, but don't think I want to see guys in leather on their hands and knees doing pup play on the streets in my city. I'm a prude. I don't like it. So I wrote about this kind of fetishistic behavior seeping into the public images around this kind of stuff, right? And it wasn't the most brilliant thing, but it did hit a nerve and people liked it. And I was correct. It was people were responding to that and saying, yeah, I don't like to see, so, but I think that I think you could still do your thoughtful pieces that might take longer, but that you're such a good writer and researcher and understander of kind of historical precedents for what we're experiencing now, that people would absolutely love what you're doing. The fact that you're not writing for Substack is a crime. I mean, your voice. Oh no, it's so needed. It's so needed. And just because there's those of us who do things quickly because we have our supporters that need to and want to be fed. They want to hear from us, and I'm happy to do it. It doesn't mean that you can't do Cy Hirsch takes 3 weeks to write a piece, and he's pretty popular right now, you see, so on Substack. So, you should be doing that.
Well, thank you. I think I would have to have something to elevate. The thing about building a platform is, as you said, people will be like, where's my new thing?
Yeah.
Whether they're paying for it or there's advertising, it becomes an expectation.
Yeah.
So my stock in trade, my one great talent is to tell the sort of broad sweeping essay that brings together felt experience with issues. It isn't to write about the thing that happened last week. It's kind of to take themes, as I did in that essay about Bettelheim, and say, here's historical precedent, and here's my own long experience with something similar, and here's how it all wraps up into this new world that we've all entered.
Yeah.
And that is a sort of, whereas it's not one specific thing, it's those essays grow out of weeks of sort of contemplation, and they go where they do.
Yeah.
And it doesn't lend itself to a schedule or necessarily a readership. Another person I'm very much in touch with and excited to meet soon is Megan Down, who you may know.
Oh, yes. She was like my second guest on my podcast.
No kidding.
Yeah, I love her. We bonded over a love of the apartment in Hannah and Her Sisters.
Oh my God.
That's
a true thing. Yeah. So I've been reading Megan since her novel, which came out in, I think, 2003. She wrote this fun novel that I reviewed about a New Yorker who moved to Nebraska and found true love.
Yeah.
And Megan has basically given up. She was an essayist along this same line.
Yeah.
She wrote long pieces that went into sort of the human experience and how to think about it. And she has put that aside to do her retreats and everything else, because she also has said, where does one go with this? There isn't a public waiting to read. As one of my professors at Iowa said, the story of an idea. A short story is the story of what happens. An essay is the story of an idea.
Well, that's interesting, because didn't we used to go to New Yorker for that? And it doesn't, I don't buy it anymore, because there may still be wonderful things in there, but there was also they were full on in the Russia hoax. Their COVID coverage was terrible. I can't do it. I can't do it. So I don't know that Substack can't be a place for ideas. I don't know that. I believe people are yearning for a multitude of different voices. And, there are people like, Matt Taibbi and Leighton Woodhouse and Michael Schellenberger and David Zweig and all of these guys who are remaking what journalism is are doing it on Substack, and they're doing a brilliant job. But there's all kinds of other writing too that that generates its own audience. And I, I think maybe you wouldn't make a huge living at it, but I think writers want to write, don't they? And I feel like you've got so much to say. I feel like saying screw people if they're not prepared to elevate your wonderful work and do it yourself. That's what I would say about that.
Well, bless you. And I do still write the essay and think about it. And I have started to speak to some people. I did contact a publisher who's more friendly to heterodox voices.
Yes.
And his advice was not encouraging.
What did he say? What not encouraging in what way?
He said you should be writing essays for other people the way you used to. And I said, well, yeah. He said, and build up your platform on Twitter.
Yeah, yeah.
And as you know, I've worked on a television series lately, and I think television is in part, the new literature.
Yep.
I really love it. I think some great things come out on streaming services.
Well, and we're all very sad that Logan Roy is dead, right? That was a very traumatic event for me.
Is that Succession?
That is Succession, sister. One of the best written shows on the go right now.
You know what? I need to try it again.
You couldn't get into it?
I couldn't get into it.
It takes a while. It took me about 6 episodes, and I kind of fell in love with Kendall because of Kendall's drug problem. So we kind of had a moment there. But then I fell in love with Logan Roy, this wonderful sort of father who, well, he's not wonderful, he's terrible, but who, he's kind of every man's ideal. He just goes through the world spending money, making money, and telling people to F off. And he gets away with it, right? So there is something about it. And you know who is the executive producer? Frank Rich, who used to be a writer for the New York Times or maybe New Yorker. He was their theater critic, right? So it's pretty good stuff. Great music, wonderful houses. And I would give it another try. What do you like right now? What are you watching that you like?
So I will tell you the 2 best written series, in my opinion, of all recent history were The Americans, which I finished with enormous sadness because I thought it was like a Russian novel. I thought it was just extraordinary.
That's the spy. They were spies or something, right?
Yeah. But it was set, it happened to be set in the time period that I was growing up in a very similar circumstance. And the young woman, the daughter, was exactly my age. So it was like my childhood if my parents had been Russian spies. It was just beautifully written.
Yeah.
And the other one I always throw out is Nurse Jackie. I thought Nurse Jackie was just extraordinary.
Yeah, it was great. Really good. Yeah.
These days, I watch a lot of not so great stuff.
Yeah. Well, we all do. We all watch not great stuff. Well, the Succession is almost, this is the last season. And because Logan's dead, I probably ruined it for you now, but.
Well, you and every headline in America, because, somehow this seemed to be a big deal.
Yeah, huge. It was a huge deal. They didn't think many people think the series can't survive without him, but I'm not really, really following anything in particular right now. I do a lot of have done a lot of British crime ones, like, I loved All Creatures Great and Small, which is not a crime story, but because of the countryside and the simplicity of that life. And I also, there's things like Grantchester and other kind of silly British ones. Broadchurch. Yeah. The best, that last episode when she finds out it's her husband. I mean,
absolutely heartbreaking.
Like the best acting in TV ever. Like that was it for me. I just thought, I think she's great.
Oh, wait. Don't we have a Happy Valley?
Happy Valley.
Happy Valley was my very favorite show.
Me too.
And I have not seen season 3. So
I did. I found it online.
I know you did.
I know it was so bad. But I couldn't wait. And she's totally my spirit animal, that chick. I think she
is the best. In fact, I have watched things that are terrible because she's in it.
She's in them, I know.
Yes.
Well, you know what's great about her as an actress? She used to be really thin, and now she's not. And she doesn't care that she's not, and she still looks beautiful, even though she's not a Skinamarink.
So I really,
lovely. I did that.
So Happy Valley was to me the best written of those British dramas that I saw. In that, and I'm going to go back to that essay idea, that sort of we're braiding together what's happening in a small British town when drugs take hold, and what happens to a mother when she's raising this grandchild that she has mixed feelings about. And I thought there were so many beautiful elements in that show, and it just got more.
Well, the tough and tender mom, like like tough and tender, right?
Yeah.
I like that characterization. I'm actually a little bit hostile to women who are super gentle. So I like that. You know, she fought men, she punched them in the nose, and I thought that was just great. I loved it. Yeah.
Yeah. So
let's get back to resolving your career. So
let's do that. Maybe I should become a police inspector.
You're too kind.
All
you're too
5,
nice.
2.5 of me.
Yeah, you're too nice.
I'll tell you, my approach has always been a sort of surveying. You know, I don't necessarily know what the next move is, but it comes.
Yeah.
And I was totally bowled over to become someone who spoke out on Twitter. I started COVID with like 300 followers and no one cared at all what I said.
Yeah.
So we'll see. You know, things change, and I don't know what the next thing is. I know that I will tell a story somewhere.
Well, stories are the things that save us, aren't they? And I think the thing about COVID and the last 3 years is that I actually don't know what the story is. Like you know, I did CJ Hopkins on my TNT radio show for 2 hours last week. One of my favorite writers on the Globo cap, as he calls them, kind of craziness. He feels that whatever was going to happen has already happened, and we're already living sort of under tyranny. And I kind of agree with him. But I, aside from telling individual stories, and even this documentary I'm working on now that you know about, I don't know what the overarching theme is. Like I know they got it wrong. I know they built the pandemic response on a bunch of stuff that was untrue and actually probably were lies, right? But other than that, I can't explain why the media was all singing from the same songbook and using the same phrase. I can't explain why every government fell to this nonsense. I can't. And so I will embrace with equal or near equal enthusiasm a conspiracy theory that it was all planned 5 years ago, or just that people are weird and groupthinky and cowardly and lazy and stupid and mean, which is the other story.
That's
right?
the one I'm going with. You know, I have to tell you, when you look back through history, and the story to me here, so I used to tell my students when I taught creative writing that the purpose of writing is to illuminate something. It's to bring some kind of light. Even if what you're illuminating is evil, it is to bring something helpful and in some way hopeful to the world.
Yeah.
So I'm still searching for the hopeful here, because what I see is what happened to us was the result of selfishness, kind of a callow, not far thinking, immediate self-gratification that just fell like dominoes. As you said, politicians got a bump from doing a lockdown. So of course they did another one.
Yeah.
And that is such a simple and just lazy evil kind of story. Oh, we're going to mow down all these people because, hey, we might get a 1.5 point lift because that's the way the polls are going. And it seemed to be one after another of those. You know, Anthony Fauci, who I believe in my bones is an evil troll.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Who did all the wrong things for all the wrong reasons, but they were all about ego and power.
Always.
There was nothing interesting. There was nothing there was no, secret reason. It was all about, I want to feel better about myself. And at a certain point, I looked at COVID and said, oh, apparently the Napoleon complex drives a whole lot of stuff that happens.
Yeah.
And so I think it was that. I think it was this amorphous sort of lots of dumb, lazy, self-serving people who convinced a whole lot of other people that this was the best way. And I can't find the thing to illuminate in that yet. I will work forever.
I'm with you. Like I had a guy on the podcast, and he's going to be in the film too, and his wife, Anna, Bill Shadwick and Anna Cascone. He's a mathematician and a good one, Fields Institute and all that stuff. And he said, public health is they're not the bright lights of medical school. They're not all that smart. And he said the modelers also, same thing. It's kind of a relatively newish phenomenon. They almost always get it wrong. And he can cite chapter and verse all the instances of people who got it wrong, including Neil Ferguson, who got it wrong many times in the UK, including a hoof and mouth disease in 2001, where they culled tens of thousands of cattle. And there's these terrible BBC videos of farmers sobbing as their cattle are in these heaps piled 2 stories high, up in flames because of this threat that wasn't even there, right? So he says a lot of it, I think a lot of it has to do with how we have handed over a lot to the so-called expert class. And it's kind of an emperor's new clothes thing, right? They're not that bright. And the people who lead them are not that bright. And our politicians, these are not our best people. Let's face it.
Oh my God, these are not our best people.
These are not our best people. So let's just, I want to pick that up, but I want to just, while we're saying our best people, I'm wondering what you think about Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s moment. What do you think about that?
Oh, among the not our best people, he is not the worst of not our best.
Yeah.
I think he talked about the wisdom of lockdown for environmental purposes at the beginning of COVID.
He did not, did he?
He did.
Oh, boo.
Oh, yeah. There are tweets from him talking about how not only is lockdown the right thing to do, but the benefit is that from an environmental standpoint, this will be so wonderful.
Ugh.
And they've kind of memory hold that in his campaign bid.
Yeah.
And so I do not trust. However, Joe Biden,
Yeah.
like our worst person, and again, our worst person. So you catch me in a bad place where all I can say is, oh, am I embarrassed to be an American?
Yeah, I know it's brutal. Well, I tweeted, Bobby Kennedy has ignited this little flame of hope that people have. And that's what's so interesting, especially on social media. People are like, oh, it's going to be great. And I very innocently tweeted out this morning that he's got to deal with his background. and he's got to do it soon, and he's got to do it once, and then he's going to drop it. But he's going to say, yeah, I was a shitty husband, and I had problems with women, and I did bad things, and I was an
I'm a
addict.
Kennedy.
And,
what do you expect?
and I'm a Kennedy. Yeah, it's in the DNA. But, and I'm an addict, and I'm sober now, which I know he is because I know somebody very close to him, related to him, who I'm extremely fond of. And so he needs to, I tweeted out that he needs to do that. He's got to, from a PR perspective, he's got to deal and then admit it and then move on, right? And what happened on Twitter with people this morning was like, well, Trish, he can't, that's old news and he didn't mean to be bad and da-da-da. And that may all be true. But he was a perfect shit to women. The suicide of his last wife is a absolutely heinous story. Who knows what's true? I don't know what's true about it, but it's still something he's got to deal with and then move on. But people were mad at me even saying, I'm sure people listening to the show right now will be mad that I'm not completely in love with Bobby Kennedy Jr. I don't not want him to run, and I don't not, he can win. That's fine. Anybody's better than Joe Biden. But we have to be real. We can't beatify people. We either beatify them or hate them. And we can't do that anymore. Like we have to, Bobby's flawed. He's also extremely bright. And, what he said in his speech was uplifting and needed. So that's all good. But we got to look at everybody for who and what they are and were, and then we can make an assessment there.
Yes. And sometimes, we're all flawed. And certainly his flaws have been out in the public realm. And I would say, not only address them, but capitalize on, use what you've learned, because
yes.
This denial of, the rewriting, it drives me crazy no matter who is doing it. When they look you straight in the face and say, oh yeah, that didn't happen, or be real about what was. Unfortunately, that's not a part of our, it's not a part of our political world right now, but it's not part of our world in general.
Yeah. So how is Jennifer doing? I mean, Jennifer Say, I know she's has a film coming out about school closures and children, I think, last time I talked to her. So what's her future like?
Oh, I assume that she will find exactly the right marketing plus, sort of brilliant, open-minded public relations position.
Yeah.
I really believe that. She's immensely talented.
Yeah.
And, everything that she's done eventually has turned around. When she originally accused her gymnastics coaches of abuse, she got the same kind of, I hope I'm remembering this correctly, but, put her in a corner, like, don't listen to her. She's a problem. And then, of course, it all came out that she was just one of the early voices.
Yeah.
And I believe she's always one of the early voices, and that will be rewarded.
Yeah.
I'm sure it doesn't help her to hear me saying that with no definite path to offer, but I just think, she's just definitely, inevitably going to come out on top.
And what did you mean about Megan Daum's retreats? What's she doing there?
Megan Daum is doing what she's calling the unspeakeasy retreats, and these are basically retreats for women, which, yes, she said is problematic. The word women.
Yeah.
Retreats for women who want to speak their mind and not be bound to a certain ideology and, want a kind of bounty of viewpoints.
Yeah.
And she said that this came out of, she was doing writing retreats, as so many writers do when they have to monetize. They do these, come to a mansion in Connecticut and we'll all write together. And the women would come and they would spend most of their time talking about issues instead of writing.
Yeah.
And so now she's running these retreats throughout the country.
They're so good. We did those in AA. We would have these women's retreats, and we went there to, work the program, but we also found ourselves just talking about things. It was wonderful, really good for us. Yeah.
Well, she's going to be in my area in May.
You going?
I am. I'm speaking.
Oh, are you? That's
I
good.
am.
That's good. And what about your, I know you have this TV project. So is that going to come out somewhere, or what's the situation with your TV project?
Okay, it's a very funny story.
Okay.
So when my essay about Bettelheim came out, I got many, many, many emails and messages, and one of them was from a television writer, a guy who happens to live in Minnesota. And he wrote to me and he said, I loved this essay, and I feel so similarly, and I think that this would be a blockbuster television show.
Yes.
So he and I got together. He's just a fabulous guy. He's sort of a Sam Elliott type,
Nice. Yeah.
handlebar mustache and Carhartt jacket. And his history is that he was one of the only USC film students who ever sold a series while in the program. He sold a series on transplant physicians to CBS.
Wow.
12, 14 years ago. Big success. And so he said to me, I've been looking for a project that excites me, and this one does. Would you be willing to get together? We spent a year, really got to be very friendly. He's a nice person. He's funny. He's smart. We had a great time working together. And throughout that year, we would go in front of his agent and management team to formulate our pitch. Now, this is right after COVID, when everything goes to Zoom, and they kept kind of working with our pitch, like, I think maybe you should go first. No, wait, maybe you should tell your story up front. Why are you telling your story up front? You should save that for the last part of the pitch. It was like every time we went back, there was a different idea about how you pitch over Zoom. And finally, I said to him, we've spent 8-9 months talking to these women about how to pitch, how to take this idea and take it out there. Why don't we just write? So he and I sat down and we wrote a pilot episode. And it was all the things that we had talked about with these women, the characters we had talked about and the setting that we'd talked about. And we put it all together. But when we wrote it, we drew a parallel between Bruno Bettelheim and his theories about autism and the COVID theories.
Yeah.
And suddenly in our writing, because we're actually, it was funny. There's a scene where a woman walks into a coffee shop and is told that she has to wear a mask unless she's sitting down and drinking. So she immediately drops into a chair and opens up her water bottle. And then they're like, oh, okay. And it was blatant, as my essay was, in saying, we must question these dictates. He sent this episode to his management team and agent, who apparently had not read my essay or my Twitter or anything and did not know that this is where we were going. And they got back to him. The management team said to him, if you continue to work with her or on this series, we will drop you and you will never work in Hollywood again. And the agent, who I like very much, smart, wonderful lady, really got along with her, sent us a note such as I have never seen an agent send in my life. It said, this fails on every level, the characters, the story, the approach, the setup. It is all bad. I cannot have anything to do with this.
Wow.
And I've seen agents who get, urine-soaked paper manuscripts thrown through their window, and they're like, well, there's a lot to love here, but you need someone who's a little more. This is how agents are. They're very diplomatic, and they're very never want to burn a bridge. She burnt. She set fire to that bridge, and then an hour later wrote me this long apologetic email, basically saying, I hope you find someone who can represent this. You have a great story to tell. It was just odd. So my co-author, who, has basically been given an ultimatum to stop working with me or lose his standing in Hollywood.
Wow.
Is in a tough spot. And I'm not going to say anything to put him in a worse place, So the agent, God bless her, she whatever the female version of a mensch is, she managed to, circle around the system and say to me, really, I like you, you're good. Find someone who will help you with this. And that's where we sit.
But okay, this is my question. What if you had asked her what's afoot here? What do you think she would have said? Would she have admitted you're criticizing COVID policy and that's just not going to go down? And what was the nub, do you think?
I think it was even more complicated than that. I think from the beginning, my collaborators' management team, who, as I said, I think did no research, didn't read my essay, didn't know what the genesis of this whole Bruno Bettelheim thing was about. Mm-hmm. They kept interjecting but wait a minute, can we make him like a madman? Can he roam the streets at night? And then they came up with this oh, here's an idea. There could be a poisoning, and then the mother goes to prison, and then there's this lesbian sex scene. They kept trying to sort of jam it into either Orange is the New Black or something.
Yeah, they do that. Yeah.
Right. And we just kept saying, no, this is actually a story about a real thing. If the mother ends up in a women's prison, that takes away from the story about the autism. And so right from the beginning, I think they wanted, this particular team wanted something a little more obvious.
Yeah.
Let's say.
Yeah. Well, they do. Yeah.
They wanted women's prison. Oh my God, did they want that? At one, there was a Black character that we had introduced because I found this really touching video of women talking about the way Bettelheim affected their lives. And this Black woman said, our son was taken to the Bettelheim Institute and we were told that he wasn't autistic because only middle-class white children were autistic. And so she said, at the time it seemed so wrong. And then I realized that I was sort of saved by this. I was saved this awful separating of me from my son. And I thought this was such a beautiful and awful and real story. So we brought a character in and the manager said, oh, she has to be the hero. And I said, but she actually didn't suffer the effects of Bettelheim. Oh, well then she has to be the one who kills him. And I'm like, wait a minute.
I know. It's just, I could have said that they would say that because that's what's playing out on streaming services right now.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we'll work it out. We have a great story. I really enjoy my co-author, and God, I'm learning a lot. Yeah. And I think eventually we'll figure it out. We've been given the agent's blessing to go out and find a home.
Well, there will be, I think in the not too distant future, probably some enlightened producer at a streamer or someplace that's going to realize they've got to start taking, they've got to start taking some of this content, because the experience we had was not the majority experience, but it's certainly, I mean, the truckers showed us that there are many, 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 many people out there who saw through this and whose sort of needs, whose media needs are not being met by, by them, right?
Well, and it's already started to creep in. Saturday Night Live did a skit about maybe the advice we got wasn't quite right.
Oh, did they? I didn't realize that. Oh, that's good. Good.
And the whole mask thing, and Bill Maher has been doing yeoman's work.
Well,
saying
they can sign us up as consultants, right? Once, if Netflix wants to start doing the story properly, they can hire us and we'll consult on everything, because they don't know what they're doing. Although I heard somewhere that nobody wants to mention COVID in any new shows now either, right? It's not written as a backstory. I'm not seeing it anywhere.
Right. Yeah, no. And I think that'll turn, like, all of a sudden it'll become okay, or even, fair game.
Yeah.
And that's where you're going to see it, because you always see it in drama and in art and in comedy, particularly, where these wonderful comedians are kind of holding open the doors of free speech and rational thinking, and I believe it's coming, and all of a sudden it's going to be like, hey, where's my heterodox COVID story? I need one of those. Hulu has one.
Well, somebody should be optioning, Jay Bhattacharya's life story for a lovely scripted drama about what real heroism looks like, right?
That. Yeah. Maybe that's what I'll do. I'll call up Jay and say, hey, can we work on your memoir?
Do it. Yeah. Actually, I'm sure if he doesn't have a book deal, he will be getting one soon. And you should reach out to him on something like that, because the more people know those guys, Martin, Sunetra's she hangs back a bit, because I think she was so tarred and feathered in the UK that I think she was quite traumatized by it. But they're such decent people. I mean, Jay has never let me down, right? He sent me a picture a couple of days ago of him wearing the We the Fringe Trish Wood is Critical baseball cap, right? Like, he's so loyal and good. He just is who he appears to be. There's no artifice around him. And
I have had a couple of notes from both of those men.
Yeah.
And they are just courtly is the word that I think.
Lovely. Yes,
they
courtly.
Are
yes, courtly.
So lovely. And I just think, and throughout, they maintained it throughout.
Yeah.
Got beaten from all sides, and they were gracious and smart and consistent and well-spoken.
And look at the other side. Certainly the emails are not looking good for Tony Fauci, and the Twitter files. It's a disaster. But, we're back to the idea that if mainstream media is not covering it, I know there was even a threat against Matt Taibbi by one of the Democrats from that hearing, who is
isn't that crazy?
I know, it's madness. It really is McCarthyism 2.0. There's no question about that. That's what those hearings look like. Seeing those poor two lads in their little suits that that Michael and Matt never wear suits. You could tell. It was like... Those are their funeral suits or something, right? With their little hands up and everything. I was so proud of them. They took such a beating with good grace, and, they're really doing yeoman's work. But now what? They want to put Matt Taibbi in jail? Like, over my dead body. I will be down there chaining myself to the whatever jail they're going to stick him in before they can do that.
I do believe that he will come out of this as one of the true... Like, he stood as tall as anyone can.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
And he has suffered the slings and arrows, no matter how much, protection he has, I can imagine this is just awful for him. And I really do think of him as the person who is keeping journalism what it needs to be.
Yeah, him and Schellenberger, and there's a guy named Leighton Woodhouse and a guy named David Zweig and a couple of others, but Matt's out front. Interesting, he was also an early guest for me, and I remember asking him, in those days he was just kind of newly cut loose and pretty independent, and he'd been raking the Democrats over the coals, so he was homeless, even though he was a Democrat until very recently. And I said, what does your wife think about the risk you're taking? And he said, well, we did talk about it. So I'm sure it's paid off. He's got a big following now, and he's made enough money that they're hiring people, which is great. And I'm sure he's not worrying about, funding their next baby. But he took a big risk, and he's taking different kind of risks now. But it's,
Well, and when you have someone threatening you with 5 years of prison time,
yeah,
as outrageous as that threat is, as unfounded, it has to be just terrifying that a public official is doing this.
Yeah. Awful. They're awful people. And I'm so glad I'm not American, but hey, we've got, Trudeau up here who is terrible in different ways. I mean, it's just, talk about not sending our best people. I mean, yikes. And there's nobody on the horizon for me either. I was interviewed a couple days ago by Rupa Subramanya, who I admire very much. Her coverage of the convoy was great. And she's got her own podcast now. And I was talking about the CBC, and I said, there's just no, like Pierre Poilievre, I keep getting his name wrong, but I'm terrible at French, but he should be maybe the Ron DeSantis, but he's not. Like we don't have anybody good up here right now. So I don't know what we're going to do. And good people don't want to run because the media, if you run right of center, you're a white supremacist, whatever, so this is why we get swine running the country and sitting in our House of Parliament and in your houses down there too. Like these are not good people. They don't give a shit about us either. They do not. None of them sat back besides Roman Baber and Ron DeSantis and said, and there were a couple other governors too, and said, gee, do you think that the cure is more harmful than the virus? None of them cared because they were getting political points from doing extreme things. And so they kept on doing it. That is a terrifying idea, and that they will keep on doing a bad thing because people are agreeing to it. Wow. We know what that sounds like. So, yeah.
It is. And it is going on here. I do marketing work in addition to my literary work. And one of the obstacles for me right now is that Dean Phillips is very involved with the marketing people here in town.
Who's that? I don't know who that is.
He's a representative. He's a big money guy, was Phillips Distilling, so had a big vodka empire, sold that, had a big gelato. He did a big gelato thing for a while and made buckets of money on that. And he now has this, immense house out on the lake and his very progressive values. And he happens to be, for reasons that are beyond this conversation, just tied in, sort of wound into the local advertising and marketing community. And that has presented me with a lot of issues because when I speak out, it is seen as heretical against his ethos.
We'll get used to it. We're all heretics now in one way or another, right? Wear it proudly. Get the T-shirt, wear it proudly, and keep on going. And I think maybe we'll win. I have to think that. I think on a local level we have a bigger chance. Although in Toronto we're about to elect probably a far, far, far left mayor, which means more stupid city planning, like bike lanes in a city where it snows most of the year. And so they want to get rid of cars, right? They want cars
I'm with
gone.
you, sister.
Yeah, I mean, or they want
Yeah.
So I think my next obsession might be the 15-minute city or something like that. But we're just it really it's the recognition that what the citizens actually want is now derided as populism, and that is an epithet, right? If you want the government to do what you want them to do, you're a bad person. And they've sort of codified that now. They did it with Brexit, and anybody in Canada who complains like I do about the densification in my neighborhood, I'm some like anti-green monster because I don't want to live in a construction site, which I do now. And it's going to be so bad. This is how bad it is where I live. I will probably have to rent an apartment somewhere else in order to do my show because the noise here in the summer from construction is so loud. And I call City Hall and I complain, and Josh Matlow is my counselor, and I call him, and like no one actually cares about our quality of life anymore. They actually don't care about our quality of life.
Well, it's interesting. I was in Toronto recently in a taxi.
Yeah.
And the taxi driver, the entire ride, was saying, and look at, do you see those buildings right next to the highway? And they're building more.
Yeah.
And he was absolutely infuriated.
Yeah. We all are, but they're gonna, we're somehow the lefty, super green people who are ruining our city are going to get in. That we have Olivia Chow make it in, and I think Josh Matlow, who's my counselor, has a chance. And what's interesting about Josh Matlow is that 6 years ago, he was anti-development in Midtown Toronto. He was a rabidly anti. In fact, I spoke at a meeting on his behalf, a town meeting where we were trying to shut this stuff down, right? He's completely changed. He doesn't even acknowledge when I saw him in my building during a campaign, he doesn't even acknowledge that happened anymore because green density is the way to go. And if you are not all in for that, then forget it. You can't hold office in this city. So they're just, they are actually literally destroying Toronto. And I and my kids too, we can't wait to get out of here. I'm waiting for the day when I can afford a country house. Yeah, because I thought, you've seen our apartment, right? It's pretty nice, and we hope that we would. Yeah, we thought we could. It was hard to get in, and we renovated it, even though it's only a rental. We thought we'd maybe die here, but now we got to think of moving on, maybe because we're surrounded by construction of buildings that are 40 stories high in a residential neighborhood. There's no parking for them. There's no more room on our road. It's just nothing. They're just doing it because somebody said it's green, and that's boom. That's what we're doing. Yeah. It's brutal. Yeah. Anyway, that's my little rant about Toronto. I'm so glad you came on the show today.
It is so good to talk to you.
I know.
However it happens.
I know. It was so good. I know our audience, I get asked about you a lot, so I know they're going to be really glad that we did this. And I do a COVID show every couple shows because I think we still have to keep thinking our way through it. I diverge into other topics, but I think we've got to keep trying to figure out what the hell just happened. And I don't think we have yet. So thank you for doing this. I'm very grateful to you.
We have to lift that dome of fear.
Yeah.
We have to lift that thing that descended on us. And you're doing it.
Thank you.
God, Trish, I wait to hear your voice on my podcast app. And so thank you for like 3 years of pacing me through this.
People feel the same about you and your brilliant writing. So keep on going. And get a Substack. Don't keep us waiting, sister. Just
get a Substack.
Throw something up there, just a few thousand words. Anyway. Okay, thanks.
I'll get on that.
Yeah, okay, good. And give my regards to Megan, too. She's a great heroine of mine as well. So, yeah.
Oh, yes, I will.
Okay. Thanks, Ann. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye. So that was my interview with Ann Bauer. And I just want to end by saying that I don't mean to bring you a lot of doom and gloom. And I thought maybe the humor in there kind of offsets that a little bit. We had a couple of laughs. But as I said at the beginning of the show, I feel like we need to keep unpacking what happened. Not on every show. I'm going to switch it up a bit and do other topics as I have been doing. But I think we can't let the bastards sneak away, can we? Pardon me for saying that. I know I promised I wouldn't swear anymore, but we can't. We can't let them sneak away and close the door or say, oh, we didn't know, or say, oh, it was a novel virus. How could we have predicted? That's all not true, right? It was, as I said, it was political. And some of them were stupid and some of them were nefarious, but we can't let them just walk away. Stick with us, stay critical, stay listening to Trish Wood is Critical, and we'll do our best to try to keep this in the public sphere and people talking about it and thinking about it. I hope something emerges one day that we can fully understand what happened. I am not a conspiracy theorist per se, although I would believe anything about this at this point. I'm so baffled, but I do think it was groupthink and stupidity and politics and all of the terrible, weak things that we seem to be more generally right now at this time in our culture. But also remember all the great heroes. There are many, many, many heroic people. She's one of them. And you've heard many of the other ones on this show. So stick with us. We're going to keep on going. And we're so grateful that you're here with us too. I often think about the people who listen to this show. I read every single email. I'm going to have an email day too and start responding. I'm behind a little bit, but I will respond. And your words of kindness mean more than I could ever say. So thank you so much for that. And as we say, stay critical. See ya.